Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day here on the show, I do want to remind you yet again that if you wish to interact with the show a little bit more directly throughout its duration, consider making yourselves available with the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way, as always, to contribute and interact with the show. You can go to our website, gsmcpodcast.net, leave a tip or donation there, or you can do it directly through YouTube by pressing the $sign in the chat box in the comment section, or you can just leave a question, comment, or concern you may have throughout the show. I'll be able to read it on air. Love getting your guys' opinions on things. It just makes the show that much more smooth and thus much better. But without further ado, let's jump into our second segment of the day. We go from good to bad. From guys who I think could be penciled into your roster immediately to guys who can ride it out on the bench this week. And it's always tough, trying to figure out matchups where people you feel like can definitively sit games out for you in fantasy. But I'm starting to see certain patterns of games that really take up the national spotlight and games where it's starting to become a little bit easier based off of matchup to really see certain teams who don't necessarily need to be uplifted by certain players play against teams that I just feel like are at this point better than them. So I think that all of these players are capable of having big games, but I don't necessarily feel like they're at a point in the season where their teams can sustain them because they're not necessarily playing in the high-profile games they need to be, if that makes sense. Without further ado, let's talk about them. Starting off with a guy at the QB position who's actually going to be playing against the QB who I picked in my starts. Let's talk about Drake May, because he is a solid rookie quarterback, but he's a very confounding one, because I feel like at this point in his career, it's safe to say most of the faults that we see in his game stem from other external factors or internal factors. The offensive line, perhaps not much coherence yet in terms of play calling and things of that nature, but overall, I still feel like there isn't necessarily a structure for him to key in on and learn from just yet. I feel like this is a trial by fire for him, and so he is kind of playing a little bit more off the cuff than some other rookie quarterbacks who have been in their respective systems for longer. And so I feel like in certain games, we're going to see him kind of play a little bit more timid than usual, because I feel like the Patriots matchups over the last couple of weeks were a little bit more simplified. This Rams game is very complex because I don't necessarily know which version of the Rams are going to show up, but I do know that they themselves believe that they should be winning games of this nature this late in the season because they feel they're the caliber of a playoff team. And the Patriots right now are definitely not. And so that disparity kind of leaps out at me when I look at games that aren't as thrilling and exciting as others in the league. So I feel like even though I think Stafford will have a big game and I wanted to kind of hype him up outside of, some more high-profile quarterbacks playing in high-profile games. But on the flip side of things, I have to look at Drake May and think, if I were him and I were in this system playing a game that is meaningless to me but is more meaningful for my opponent, then, what's the point of even trying, really? And I feel like that's part of the frustration that's coming with being that New England Patriots quarterback, because I feel like Drake May and Jerod Mayo know his talents, and this organization knows his talents, but they're at a point where they can't trust it week in, week out. And so, as much as I think the best of Drake May, and this is not necessarily an indictment of his game, I truly believe he can have a successful career in the NFL. These games for him don't necessarily mean anything. You're not playing a team that you feel you can beat, and you're kind of playing out the season going through the motions almost. And as good as you play, it's not necessarily going to be of any import for your team. It's just more important for your development. And so while it's a good thing for him, I can't necessarily say from a fantasy perspective at this moment in his career, week in, week out, he's going to remain as consistent as he's been against, similar competition. Because the Rams are definitely coming into this game with a vengeance after last week. So look for him to struggle in this one. And then the running back position, I picked Breece Hall mainly because not just the Jets' offense in general, but also because this is a very physical Colts front who I'm actually really liking in terms of not just their style of play, but who they played it well. They've corralled running backs like James Cook, who I picked my starts this week, like, Aaron Jones a couple of weeks ago, and they're starting to come into their own. They're starting to develop this kind of identity that screams top 10 defensive unit like a lot of people thought they would be. And so Breece Hall, who's already been struggling mightily this season, is going to have a tough test ahead of him. I think he's going to be used a lot more, perhaps, just to alleviate some of the burdens placed on Aaron Rodgers. And I hope it happens, because that's just me saying personally what I believe is best for the Jets at this point in the season if they truly want to get something out of it. But either way, this team just is not necessarily sustainable in terms of their offensive style week in, week out. You can't just go out there and say, okay, Aaron, throw to Devontae Adams X amount of times and hope he makes an explosive play, or, have Garrett Wilson make an acrobatic catch to save you in some games. It can't be the offense week in, week out for the New York Jets. And so I wish I could speak more positively of Breece Hall, because he could be their saving grace this season. But I think they're underutilizing him. That's what's taking the kind of excitement and hype surrounding him as a fantasy prospect away, because they've really diminished his role this year, and I feel like they should have bolstered him a little bit more instead of, focusing on Aaron Rodgers doing it all back there, because Aaron Rodgers looks more lost than Breece Hall was when he was playing with guys that were much worse than Aaron Rodgers, ironically, like Zach Wilson and Tim Boyle and Trevor Siemian. So it's an affront to Breece Hall to kind of take away his importance from the team. So as much as I wish he weren't on this list this week, it's kind of out of necessity. It's kind of out of what I'm seeing from the Jets this season. Now, the wide receiver position, another simple one here, because this guy's just truly been a disappointment, and this team has been a disappointment all year. It's got to be Calvin Ridley, because this has to be the toughest matchup for any receiver in the National Football League now against this Lions defense that suddenly has its secondary becoming its strength. And they still don't even have Zadarius Smith up front, so this defense is just getting ever more scarier. But in terms of the matchups for Ridley, I just feel like it's too reliant on, this connection between him and Will Levis. Actually, I'm thinking about the Jaguars. I don't know why, because he wasn't the Jaguars. They're facing the Vikings, which might even be worse, because their secondary might not necessarily be the most popular in the NFL by any stretch of the imagination, but it's still one that is going to immediately harass Will Levis, and thus kind of neuter any connection that Will Levis and Calvin Ridley might have tried to develop. And the thing is, there was no connection to begin with, so this matchup already is sucky for Calvin Ridley. And so I feel like, Calvin Ridley is one of those receivers where time has passed him by. His career is passing him by. And languishing on a Titans team without a definitive answer, whether it be at the quarterback position or organizationally, you have to be frustrated. Because I feel that at least when DeAndre Hopkins was there, this was a shared experience of ineptitude for this Tennessee Titans offense, because at least there were two guys who had felt like, their careers are over the hump a little bit and they're riding out the season with this bad team. But now DeAndre Hopkins is gone, and it's just Ridley sitting there languishing with this team. So I can't week in, week out justify having him. And then real quickly, to sum it all up, at the tight end position, it's Kyle Pitts. I just feel like this no-name Broncos defense is the kind of typical defense you would expect can immediately dominate this Falcons offense. They can generate pressure on Cousins and thus limit his passing abilities and force him to throw the football a little bit less accurately, and thus Kyle Pitts suffers, even though he's going to be the one trying to break down this Broncos defense, getting behind the linebackers, exploiting their zone coverages. But I just don't see it, because this Broncos defense is for real. They're very physical, and I really like what they've been doing. And last but not least, let's go to the defense and special teams. That's what I was thinking with the Jags. The Jags against the Lions, because nobody wants to face this Lions offense. No matter how, intriguingly well this Jaguars team has played against great competition, I still don't see a path where they can truly dominate and ultimately win this matchup against the Lions offense. They're just ticking in every single department. So that's why I have to take the Jaguars to sit this one out. And who really wants to play the Jaguars defense anyway in any matchup? Because, like I said, they could be good in some weeks, but they're never, a defense that ultimately wins you games in real life or in fantasy. So that's why they find themselves on this list. But that should just about do it for all my starts and sits for the week, except for my last segment, which will be really fun. But now, right after this short break, we get into some implications, specifically in the NFL, and some big games for this week. How does it affect your fantasy team? We'll be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having